I would like to tell a story about a dictator who undertakes an anti-corruption campaign. And I'm doing this as an allegory to explore two types of judo, where one of them is judo of mass frustration. And of course, judo is essentially, it's a martial arts sport, but part of the deal there is if somebody's coming at you with a lot of energy, you're looking for strategies to turn that energy back on themselves. That's the whole deal with it. And so the notion here is that can this dictator see this energy of mass frustration, perhaps legitimate frustration based on the way he's running the country? If he sees that coming at him, can he turn it around so that that energy has people pointing their negative frustrations at each other? And then the second idea I want to explore with this is the notion of judo of language, where anti-corruption obviously might be justly attached to the mass frustration. But language is how people sort out what is in the public's best interest, when can we enact collective action against something that's oppressive, and if that language is kind of messed up in a certain way, the language itself could have the same judo phenomenon where it takes frustration with a certain idea or concept or certain thing that's going on, and it kind of turns that energy of that idea around so that it could mean the opposite. And I think both of these are things that we see in many different arenas. So I really do mean this story as an allegory. I'm not talking about a specific country or a specific dictator. Now, has anything like this ever happened in the history of the world? Well, probably so. Maybe even in a format that's somewhat similar to the story I will tell as an allegory. But please think of this as an allegory, because the power of that is that you might see it in many different places, including situations that don't map perfectly onto the dictator anti-corruption campaign. Let me set up the story. So obviously, this is a dictator. Most dictatorships are somewhat oppressive or very oppressive, and the population feels this frustration and in some ways is searching out for ways that they could engage in collective action against the dictator. That's just kind of a natural setup. Now, the dictator, of course, is surrounded in this hierarchical setup by people who validate his perspective, stoke his ego. They each have their own goals, and they know how they have to interact with the dictator to get their own things accomplished. So most people in the hierarchy that lead up to the dictator are very much in the dictator's corner. Now, I could take two approaches to this. One is I could make a conniving, evil dictator who knows he's doing bad things and does them anyway. But I actually think it's somewhat important for us to avoid that, because I do think there are some truly evil people out there who will do things with the knowledge that they are oppressing people in certain ways. I think that does happen. But I think more often you have people who are normal people whose brains and nervous systems and guts react like normal people's react, and therefore you get a situation where everybody who's looking at what's going on and the decision making from the inside, they can all say, no, this is not an evil, oppressive guy. This is a normal guy. So I think we need to set that situation up if we want to fully understand this, because a lot of times I think what's going on is there's this fierce disagreement between people who think the dictator is intentionally acting out of harm and people who see that he's not. And the disagreement between those groups actually stops progress against the oppression. So I think that's a different type of judo that actually almost falls under this category. So let's continue our story with this dictator who's a normal guy. And what exactly do I mean when I say he's a normal guy? Well, okay, he's motivated by normal human motivations, which includes the motivation to be a hero to people around you. like to care about people around you and to want to use your agency and power in service of the community that you're a part of, that you lead. And those are naturally good desires that could be put to good use. But of course, they can also be distorted through systems where, those same traits are associated with egotism, desire for praise, desire for power. Like those map directly onto these good traits of wanting to be heroic. In which case, we have to ask the question, how does this dictator perceive the mass frustration with his regime? And of course, you can't hide from the dictator the fact that people are frustrated and they're acting out and they're criticizing. Even if you suppress the criticism, there's going to be some ways that mass frustration will seep up into this dictator's consciousness. Now, of course, part of the way the dictator will perceive this is, oh, people don't understand how systems work. All that frustration is coming from a place of ignorance and misunderstanding and all that. And just like every human has mechanisms in their gut and their brain that dismiss things that might be uncomfortable or hard to look at, our dictator does too, and that will cover some of the mass frustration. Some of it the dictator can effectively dismiss. But the problem is this mass frustration is going to become a thorn in the dictator's side. Because, of course, the dictator has his own community of people around him, and they have communities below them. And they have communities below them, and at some level, some of these people in this system, in the leadership structure, will have to deal with this mass frustration on a daily basis. So that's going to trickle its way up through the leaders of this community to the dictator in some ways. Like, how do we deal with this? And the dictator, who feels himself to be a really just and discerning judge, the dictator views his job as discerning when is it legitimate frustration and legitimate critique, and what do I do about that? And when is this something that they just need to be put in their place because they're just out of line and they're the evil ones? Okay, so where is our dictator going to get the idea for this anti-corruption campaign? And I'm actually going to make the case that our dictator is not thinking strategically, but is instead acting from his own gut. And his gut is capable of empathy. It's capable of what he believes to be enacting justice with his sort of blind justice device in his heart that he believes is there. And this is where I think we need to talk about empathy and the way empathy can play in with people's intuition for justice. And in fact, it's necessary for an intuition for justice. It can just get a little bit corrupted depending on the individual. So I think empathy can often come from something that someone feels in their gut, perhaps because they feel it on a personal level, but they recognize in someone else, oh, that person has the same experience that caused me to feel this, and therefore I can empathize with them, and I can sort of place our interests together in a way where I could act on behalf of that person, or they could act on behalf of me. We could act together in this way, where empathy is what unites their interests. So I think this does happen with our dictator, which is our dictator does have frustration sometimes from among his subordinates, because sometimes some of them disagree with him or don't fully obey or do things that he just perceives as undermining his own authority. Whether or not they were intended to undermine his authority doesn't matter, but if he perceives that person is undermining my ability to act as the hero, to enact my vision of the world, he will feel that. So I think what's going to spark this idea in our dictator is he has some officials that he is frustrated with, that he thinks aren't obeying him enough. But he kind of knows if he directly calls them out, everybody around him is really going to see, oh, this is really about your power. It's not about whatever you're pretending it's to be about. So he needs a really good excuse, and that excuse is going to be empathy, which is he's going to recognize, okay, this person down here is undermining me, and they're also engaging in the same corrupt behavior that the masses are frustrated with. This is a great moment for empathy. I don't like this person. I have a very strong negative gut reaction. Everybody else is upset about the corruption. Mostly they're not understanding things, but in that case, this is very much the type of corruption that's real that those people care about. So he marries his frustration and theirs against this lower down individual, and he goes after them. That's where he comes up with this anti-corruption campaign idea. Now, our next moment in the story is the cathartic moment for the population. Like, they have experienced in their own little realms corruption that's against them. And oftentimes that comes from officials who are sort of local and at their level. And when they see another official who's doing similar things being taken down by the dictator, there's just something very cathartic to that. Like, people project psychologically in all kinds of ways. And the catharsis we feel when we see someone taken down, that we understand the injustice of what was happening when that person was taken down. There is this celebration, there's this joy that will naturally arise from many people in the population. So, of course, our dictator is going to hear back about this joyful experience, this joyful population reaction to him addressing that anti-corruption. That's going to work its way up the chain to him. He's going to hear from his subordinates, oh, the population loves that, they appreciated that. And that will feel good. He'll be like validated as the hero, and he'll be like, hey, I would like to do some more of this. Now, some of the officials underneath our dictator are going to get a little bit nervous at this point, because they're going to be like, wait a second, what if he perceives me as undermining his authority? And what if he goes after me in this sort of horrible, public, visceral way? So there may be a little bit of ambivalence among his entourage about this. But of course, anyone who's ambivalent about something from him, that's going to naturally feel kind of threatening to him. So it might create a natural animosity between him and some people in his entourage, which makes for good cases for enacting justice in his little just way, where he's being the anti-corruption leader. He goes after those people, in which case he does more of this. He looks for moments of corruption that fit well with what his gut tells him is real corruption. And of course, he's very just and logical in the cases where the corruption people are pointing to is not really just. Like, in his mind, he's this just leader figuring out which of the cases of corruption are real and which are not real. And he gets this intuition about real and not real justice from his gut. Now, of course, his gut is highly correlated with what he feels threatened by. But that's definitely below his level of consciousness. Like, there's a lot of stuff that people cannot see in themselves, and certainly they cannot see the parts of themselves that are the darker sides. They only see the other side of the coin in terms of their own motives. He sees the hero side of that coin, not the side where the gut is sort of acting selfishly. Now, what happens in the public when he starts this anti-corruption campaign and when he publicizes all of these cases where he has gone after corrupt officials? Well, what happens is this frustration that used to be a constant thorn in his side, that frustration starts to diffuse. And the reason for this diffusion is some of the people who were previously like very anti-corruption, very, very annoying to him, some of those people don't buy this anti-corruption campaign because those people's frustration was pointed at him. So they're not willing to let him be the leader who will undertake anti-corruption. But then other people see these examples of the corrupt officials that he's putting down, and they feel so cathartic. They're like, yes, finally, our leader is being a real leader. He's on our side. And those two groups are now starting to go at each other's throats instead of pointing their frustration toward him. So he's actually looking at the population, looking at this frustration he had to deal with before, and he's seeing it dissipate in a way that he's really, really just satisfied with. His gut is like, wow, this is incredible. Do more of this. Now, if we go down to the public and we spy on a few of the conversations that happen between different people who have been very frustrated by the corruption, what we find after the campaign has started is that the conversations are way more difficult to have. Because if someone's like, I'm frustrated with corruption, you don't know, is this person on the side of the regime? Or is this person against the regime? Or is this person in a different camp altogether? And because language was the main thing that sort of brought these people together in this hope of collective action, perhaps, suddenly the language is all jumbled up so that you don't know what someone's really talking about or whose side they're really on. And of course, if the situation is, if anyone finds out in your country that you are really against the regime, that's perhaps pretty dangerous. So you can't just ask people, how do you feel about corruption anymore, to find allies. The allies don't have language that will help them identify each other. And they're losing the language to even talk about their frustration, because if they try to talk about it, it's really hard to talk about it when the language itself could be interpreted on one side or the other side, and there's so much risk with being caught on the wrong side of this debate. So our first two emergent phenomenon that are happening in the population and are just delighting our dictator are the splitting of the energy and the pointing of the energy against one another of the people who are frustrated with corruption. And second, the confusion of the language that's happening. This is like a Tower of Babel situation where suddenly the people who were that energy against the dictator can't understand each other. Those are two really powerful phenomenon. But there's going to be another phenomenon that will really delight our dictator. And that is, suddenly you have people who are allies who used to be enemies of the regime, but suddenly they're really excited about some of these anti-corruption moments. And those people are now making friends with, becoming allies with people who were always on the side of regime. And that collaboration, that friendship that's forming, that is just like heartwarming to our dictator. Like, he loves friendship. He loves seeing people finding common ground. And so this splitting of the population into two groups, where one group that used to be against him is now on his side against the group that's still against him, that is just so delicious. But that's not all. There's actually a fourth benefit here that our dictator did not even foresee, but is completely delighted by. And that is, he has a reason to be harsh on people who are in this anti-regime camp. That is, those people are in support of corruption because they're not in support of the anti-corruption campaign. They support corruption, and people who support corruption, that is an evil thing. You can convince many people that's an evil thing. So he's got his straw man face to place on anyone who tries to speak out against the regime. And he has an excuse to put them down because he's, of course, protecting the population from corruption by putting any of them down. Now, is that the end of our story? And the answer is no, because human dynamics are inherently unstable. The game theory of human politics is unstable. So that there's no happy ending for anyone, including our dictator. He always has to be vigilant about the possibility of the mass frustration in the population rising up with some mechanism of collective action. And of course, language is the main means of coming together for that collective action. So he can't just rest on his laurels for the rest of his life. And one of the ways this could start to turn against him is the people who still see, wait a second, the anti-corruption campaign is actually making the regime stronger, that group who's still against him. They may need to adjust their own language to be like, we are against centralized corruption. And of course, they're doing that to try to win back those allies they used to have, who are now in support of the current regime. And so our dictator may need to come up with a strategy for putting down those people who are against centralized corruption. It's like that word centralized that's starting to become a thorn in his side. And of course, if he had control over the media, he could maybe not allow the word centralized. If he didn't have full control over the media, his best option might actually be to do something that's Judo-like around the word centralized. If he could demonize the people who are using that and make many people feel that, ooh, the people using that are against the general populace. And so in this way, I think he could actually develop over time, not necessarily a strategic mind having to do with Judo, but more a gut intuition about what needs to happen next to put down the next rising population frustration that his gut tells him is just really, really horrible and evil. So I guess that's the end of our story, but I do want to point out, why am I telling this story, and what do I hope that you get out of this story when you're looking all over the place for this dynamic? And I think number one is game theory and strategy is not always thought through. As a matter of fact, I think most of the time it's experienced and intuited, and it comes from the gut. And it comes from the gut that feels self-interest very strongly, and that matches its own self-interest with empathy in a way that corrupts that empathy. So I hope Judo of mass frustration is something that you're on the watch out for, because I think what it could say is that people who are at each other's throats, who believe each other to be the enemy, they could actually sometimes solve the problem that they both care about most by figuring out, wait a second, is there a different enemy? Is there a different setup where we could and should be allies? Where we could build up a collective action that brings together groups that are at each other's throats. And I think we all need to be on the lookout for that.